thank you for joining us. It's 12:04, and we have a critical mass here. I want to introduce myself. I'm Josh Zakim, the Executive Director of Housing Forward Massachusetts. It's a pleasure to be here with you all for the third, as I've said, in our series of candidate conversations with the folks running to be Boston's mayor. If you were not able to join us on Monday, we have the archived conversations with Acting Mayor Kim Janey and City Councilor at Large Anissa Asabi-George available on the Housing Forward Facebook page, where this conversation is also being live streamed. We will also have the full videos posted on our website, housingforwardma.org, in the coming days. And if you have not already, signed up to follow us on Facebook or Twitter, please do so. And if you've not signed up for our further series of conversations, we will be with at-large City Councilor Michelle Wu tomorrow at noon, and former Boston's Chief of Economic Development, John Barros, will be joining us Friday at noon. Again, all of these conversations are going to be posted online on Facebook, as well as on our website and YouTube after the fact. If you have questions for the candidate, please use the Q&A tab here on the webinar. Many folks have emailed ahead of time, and we have those questions as well, which I will be asking the candidates during this conversation. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, Housing Forward is a nonprofit policy and education organization that's dedicated to working with activists, residents, policymakers, on increasing the supply of housing across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to ensure that we're meeting the needs of everybody in our community, creating all types of housing for folks at different stages of their lives. And what we're going to be talking about with our mayoral candidates this week, or continue talking about with them, is the recent Housing Forward Mass report, Housing Blueprint for Boston's Next Mayor, which outlines a series of simple policy changes Boston's mayor can do, most of which could be done on day one through executive action. It doesn't require changes in legislation. So we're excited to be talking about that with Councilor Campbell as soon as she is able to join this call, and really get into it and have those questions that you all, I'm sure, have that you've been thinking about. I see someone's already added to the Q&A button here, so we'll be getting into that. We're going to start off with just some brief questions based on our report, the Housing Forward report, and then get into it with the candidate to hear about her stances on housing development policy in the city of Boston. And then we'll be hearing your conversations and your questions as well. I also want to in particular thank Abundant Housing Massachusetts and the Mass Housing Coalition and the Great Neighborhoods Network, three organizations that helped us publicize and spread the word about these series of conversations. I know folks from all of them are tuning in today and probably have some questions for the candidates. And I appreciate everyone's patience. I've been informed there's some technical challenges on Councilor Campbell's side, but she will be joining us shortly for this conversation. And here we go, Councilor. Good afternoon, Councilor. I think you're on mute, which looks like that's intentional at this point, so that's great. Welcome, everyone. It's thank you all for joining us, Councilor. I was just introducing or reintroducing these series of candidate conversations, talking a little bit about Housing Forward, and thanking our community partners, Great Neighborhoods Network, Mass Housing Coalition, and Abundant Housing Massachusetts for helping to spread the word and their attention to this, and sort of setting the stage for these series of discussions. So I want to thank you for being here, for your work and service to the city of Boston. And if it's all right with you, I think I'll just lay out a couple baseline items generated from our report, Housing Blueprint for Boston's Next Mayor, and would love to hear from you any thoughts and ideas on increasing the supply, addressing Boston's affordable housing challenges, and really your philosophy around housing development in the city of Boston. And then we're going to go to questions from the audience, so to speak. I always like saying that. I feel like I'm a game show host. We'll go right to the audience. And that's it. But really, thank you for being here, Counselor. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
And first of all, I apologize. Thank you, Josh. And of course, thank you for everyone for being here. I apologize for being late. I was running from another meeting across the way. So really grateful to be here. And again, apologies for my tardiness, but thank you.
Sure. Well, I appreciate it. So I'll just kick things off quickly, Council. I'm going to share a statistic, which I'm sure you're familiar with, based on the City of Boston's report, Housing a Changing City, that was updated a couple of years ago, that it looks like Boston is going to need 69,000 new housing units by 2030 just to house, the current demand, so to speak. We expect the population to grow to about 760,000 people, which is great. We like that people want to be here in the city of Boston, but it's putting pressure, and it's adding to the longstanding pressure on the housing market, and the fact that there are a lot of people who have lived in this city, grown up in this city, who are finding themselves pushed out. There are people who want to come here for the economic and educational opportunities we have, who aren't able to be there. So what Housing Forward has been trying to do is propose solutions that are within the mayor's power without going to the legislature to do. And some along those lines are things about expediting the permitting process, particularly for smaller projects, particularly for affordable projects, and projects that are going to address the missing middle, the so-called missing middle housing for people who are not in low-income housing or subsidized housing, but who can't afford some of the very high upper market rents that is challenging in cities around the country right now. First-time homebuyer assistance, things like that. Talking about how you would appoint folks to the various regulatory boards, the Zoning Board of Appeal, the BPDA, the Zoning Commission, who really set the rules, so to speak, for how development happens in the city of Boston, accessory dwelling units, things like that. So I know it's throwing a lot out there, but feel free to introduce yourself broadly, and really talk about that, and I'll do some follow-up questions as we go.
Thank you, Josh. And first, thank you for convening the conversation, and thank you to everyone who is on, and for the work that folks do on this critical issue. I think every Zoom meeting, every in-person conversational forum, the housing affordability issue comes up, displacement, gentrification, all of those layers come up in the city of Boston. I have actually stressed my personal narrative, right? I grew up in the city of Boston and we were very poor, but we had access to good public housing. We also had access to affordable housing. I lived in both growing up. I'm a first-time homeowner in the city of Boston, and that is a big deal. In Mattapan, I take tremendous pride in that, and what it means to be a first-time home buyer. And I also know all that I had to allow me to get to that place. And so for me, these issues are very personal as well as, of course, professional. On the City of Boston tools, you got it right. The best thing about the city of Boston is just that we have all of the tools that are necessary right within our toolkit, actually, to be able to act swiftly and urgently to address the housing affordability issue in the city of Boston. I have put forth a plan that really pulls out all of what those tools are. I'm really proud that as a counselor, I have begun to already actually create some tools in the toolkit. The CPA was my first piece of legislation on the council, and we know that's generating $20 million.
I was remiss for not mentioning that, Counselor. Thank you for that work. Really,
yes, and really proud of that piece of legislation, which is generating nearly $20 million or more every year, including for affordable housing creation and home ownership opportunities in the city of Boston, and supporting programs that would allow folks to be able to buy homes in the city. I started the vacant lot initiative, looking at city-owned vacant lots that were vacant, blighted sometimes, that could be transformed to help us address housing issues. Right now, we have 30 RFPs out along Blue Hill Ave to be able to activate those lots. And I'm sure many will be mixed development opportunities. Majority have already been proposed as such, but really proud of that work as well. And let's not forget public housing, right? Really strengthening public housing, and proud of a program I brought into the Public Housing Authority that is literally moving people out of public housing and into homeownership opportunities. So my housing plan builds upon all of that to say, yes, with respect to supply and demand, you're right. We have to be building more housing in the city of Boston. And to do that, we're going to have to cut the red tape and bureaucracy to do that. And for me, that means not only dealing with the BPDA and the Article 80 process and removing affordable housing possibly from that process, but also ISD. the permitting inspection process, all of these departments work hand in hand, and we know they can be slow. We've heard that from builders in the city of Boston. Someone said it's easier to build affordable housing maybe in New York City than it is in Boston, which is ridiculous. The second piece is expansion of some of our financial tools. IDP is a tool in our toolkit. The CPA, well, we need to be up at the State House pushing for them to expand the match for CPA and increase that. Obviously, linkage has also come up. So there are various tools in our toolkit that we could expand responsibly while also not hindering building in the city of Boston. I've also talked a lot about continuing to be creative, and that as mayor, I would actually activate 100 of those city-owned vacant lots within the first 100 days of being elected, because there are so many city-owned vacant lots, and make sure that many are for housing purposes. The other piece is creating, whether it's voucher programs, down payment assistance, whatever it would take to make sure that those, particularly those in the middle, including some city employees, have access to all the tools they would need to be able to buy a home. So not just focusing on rental opportunities, but home ownership opportunities. So my plan really directs us at not only creating more affordable housing opportunities, but really using the housing plan to close the racial wealth gap, which is really important. And I know there are many folks on this Zoom conversation who played a significant role in my housing plan. And so I hope folks would take a look. I don't know what else you want me to say. I don't want to take the entire time.
Judging from my own notes and the question and the Q&A box, you've said a lot that people want to delve a little deeper on. So I will, I'll get right into it. I want to start with the vacant parcel initiative, which is really powerful and can be so impactful in the city. You know, one of the challenges I found in my prior life as a city councilor and even now in the advocacy world is even when folks are given land, you know, the approval process in going through it can be so challenging. So if you're talking about, again, you know, one of the initiatives or one of the policy items that we talk a lot about is allowing 3 families as of right on, you know, almost any residential parcel. So if you have these vacant parcels, and you mentioned 100 in 100 days, and obviously that's just the beginning, you know, that could be a significant impact. But it goes back to the zoning, which, you know, through the zoning commission, have you thought about making 3 families as of right in more areas of the city so that folks obviously still go through a building permit process, make sure it's safe, et cetera, but don't have the same long drawn out, sometimes a year and a half neighborhood review process? Have you given thought to that? And if so, how could that work?
You're exactly right. It goes hand in hand with being able to build quicker, right? Looking at transforming the zoning process. I think we need to take a step back, because I actually currently have a few as of right projects in my current district that people are not happy about, including myself. And this is relatively large, you know, 6-story, 5-story buildings in the middle of single family homes, where the community felt like they did not have adequate opportunity to weigh in on this as of right project, to really push that builder to do better, and frankly, to build housing that really reflected the community in Mattapan. And so this is a heated topic. I know there are not a lot of as of projects like this across the city, so I know the scope and magnitude of the problem varies, but in this particular part of my district in Mattapan, there were 3, and they're substantial. And so on the one hand, for as of right projects, I do think everyone should have an opportunity to weigh in some way with respect to what's going to be built in their neighborhood. But I also understand that we want to make it easier to build, but that's where planning comes into play. We have not done a great job in terms of planning. So we have the 2030 plan. We've learned a great deal there, but we need to go back into the neighborhoods, not some long drawn out process for the sake of planning, but to have a real deep sense of what does every neighborhood need, not just in terms of housing, but also in terms of infrastructure, economic development opportunities, you name it. And once we have that, then to change zoning, ISD, and other processes that stand in the way of building those things in a timely manner. And so, for example, in Mattapan, folks want single family, 2-family, 3-family homes. They want mixed development opportunities along Blue Hill Ave corridor, transit-oriented development. We absolutely can change zoning to allow for that to be built quicker, but the planning will help us do that, where we allow every resident and stakeholder to participate. So then we're just picking out the color and the size and the materials. So it's planning coupled with these zoning changes. And I think if we do that well, these vacant lot initiatives will be built quicker and swiftly because we will have those ideas. And I already have many for the Blue Hill Ave corridor because we've done that engagement in that planning with community thus far.
Well, I think that the planning aspect is critical. Obviously, when a project is as of right and it's so unusual, it generates some controversy. And there's always going to be some controversy around these things. But I think it's really important we look at it from a need of citywide need and across every neighborhood of increasing the supply. But with going to the planning, this was a question someone asked on Monday. I forget during which of these conversations, but about, the city often does a lot of planning discussions, a vision for this corridor, that corridor, but then it's not codified in zoning. So it sort of just becomes a recommendation. How would you address that? Would you look at, are there some of the current plans that haven't been codified that you would put into the zoning code, or would you start over? But would you, I guess ultimately it's, you do all this planning, it still has to go in the zoning code. How do you feel about that?
I think it's important, right? Because I know that there are certain communities that have been doing planning for a long time and feel as though there is building happening in their community that does not align with that plan. And so that just creates such distrust in community. I think there were some good ideas from the 2030 plan. Clearly, when we talk about climate resiliency, we want every neighborhood to be prepared. There were great plans there, but they're often separate and apart. They're not actually folded in together. When we think about historic preservation, landmark preservation, again, separate and apart, not all connected. So I do think it starts with immediately getting out to community and making sure that all residents and stakeholders have an opportunity to weigh in, including those who are in our immigrant communities, including those that don't speak English as a first language. I absolutely think the city of Boston has to do a better job in engaging those communities as well in our planning process, so their voices are heard. The average resident who does not attend a civic association meeting, who's working 2 or 3 jobs, should also be engaged. And once we do that, these plans will be reflective, right, of what folks want in their neighborhood. But there's a second piece before we even turn it into or implement it within our zoning code. And that is the second tier of planning that I think is essential, but can only be led by the city of Boston, which is how do we create a more integrated, accessible, and resilient city across every neighborhood? So a neighborhood plan, for example, may say we want A, B, and C, housing, economic, infrastructure, but the city of Boston has to say, but according to our climate and resiliency plans, we may not be able to meet that need, community, and this is why. Because it's too close to the water, right? It's too close to something that we have to prepare for in the future in terms of flooding or other concerns, or there's not enough green space or trees in a certain community, so we can't build there, or if we do, we have to be mindful of protecting the tree canopy. This is where that second tier of planning in larger perspective across every neighborhood is critical, and where that leadership from the city is important. Once we've done both, absolutely then turning to our zoning code to implement it and to make sure it's codified in the zoning code to make it easier to build, faster, of course. And so everyone knows what the plan is and what the expectation is. So we're all on the same page.
I think that's helpful. And I see there's a couple of the questions are, in a similar vein. It's
and by the way, I keep my cameras up here, but you're like down here on my screen. So I'm doing
this. Okay. Well,
you're wondering, like, where is she looking?
We'll have to see if we can fix that. But I will say, that is some of the questions is, how do we codify this zoning so that there's not so much one-off that everyone's not at the ZBA? Because what you were saying is, in your current district, where it's as of right, so it is technically planned, it's part of the city plan, but because that's so unusual, folks are concerned that they haven't had an opportunity to weigh in. However, conversely, when you have, a ZBA process, and there have been several just in the last year where low-income projects have been stalled or stopped altogether because of something like required parking minimums, that sort of thing that gives both the Board of Appeal a reason to reject something, but also neighbors, wealthy neighbors who oppose new affordable housing. And there's an incident somewhat famous now in Jamaica Plain where someone was suing on that, largely related to parking and traffic. The only solution that we've seen and that's worked in other cities has been to expedite this, create more as of right. And that actually falls in right with one of the questions from the audience is, in your housing platform, you talk about expedited approval process for affordable housing. Are you thinking of that in terms of changing the zoning code or dedicating staff or some combination thereof? Could you elaborate a little bit on that one?
Number one, I appreciate you lifting up staff. That is critical. Right now, we are seeing a lot of turnover in the city of Boston. With leadership changes in the city hall transition, right? There are a lot of folks, including from the BPDA, that have left. And so they are understaffed, including certain departments. ISD, other departments need more human capital. And we also need not just more staff, we need also folks with a greater range of expertise. When you think about the BPDA, I don't think any team members who really have a deep understanding of the finances of a project. When you're going to build a project, what it takes, how long it takes to get funding. When you're moving from rental units to homeownership opportunities, how you have to change the numbers, right? You hear builders, developers in community working in partnership with residents talking about that. But that expertise within the BPDA, I think, is critical because as residents are engaging with our agency, they also want these questions to be answered, right? The layperson wants to understand the numbers. So it really is looking at not just more staff, but also greater expertise. The second piece is Article 80. We've been talking about that. Certain types of projects, affordable housing, we say we desperately need and want these projects should be removed. And it doesn't remove community process, right? It just takes away some of the layers of bureaucracy that can take a project 2 or 3 years to go through. And that's before we get shovels in the ground. And that's just problematic when we know there's a significant demand for housing that is at affordable pricing points. And we know the longer we drag the process, it is the consumer that bears the brunt, right? The cost of the unit goes up for them. So the city of Boston really has to do a better job. I always include ISD and other departments as well, because they go hand in hand. It's not one agency that's doing this all by themselves. So that, really concrete ideas in my plan on how to streamline these processes. I've heard from planners in the BPDA, the need for cultural shifts within that department around civic engagement. Yes, we can separate the planning from development, but just cultural shift in terms of what is the overall plan. And that's why I think it's really important that we go back to the planning phase. So we have a sense as a city from the residents themselves, what they need in their neighborhoods. And we are responding as a city to those needs. The as of right projects that I referenced on River Street in my district, there were plans that were done 10 years ago. The residents there didn't have an opportunity to weigh in. And there were some zoning changes made 10 years ago. Residents didn't have an opportunity to weigh in. And so now you have someone building, but the neighborhood has changed dramatically where you have single family homes. So 10 years ago, it might have made sense to put up a 6-story building. Now it doesn't. When you think about how the cutback in terms of the open space these communities have now is limited. When you think about the congestion created by the number of cars that will come to this development, it's quite tragic. And so I do think we also have to be open to revisiting when planning and development or planning and changes in our zoning code happened 10 or 20 years ago, and the neighborhood has changed dramatically. How do we update it to really reflect what the new needs are for those residents? Also has to require us to be flexible and nimble.
So when you mentioned parking, something that study after study has shown is that creating parking, requiring parking in housing developments often adds to traffic, and it certainly adds to the cost. There's a long discussion about are you choosing parking over housing, and I think some of our fellow municipalities in the Pacific Northwest, in California right now, are starting to be a little more aggressive at reducing required parking, certainly allowing builders to put parking in if they think the market needs that. But there's a proposal before the City Council that Councilors Bach and O'Malley have put about changing the zoning code to no longer require parking in affordable projects. And that's something that goes directly to the bottom line, would allow a developer, nonprofit or for-profit who's building affordable housing to build more units. Have you had a chance to look at that? What are your thoughts on that? And feel free to speak broadly about your philosophy on parking requirements as well.
So I have, and I know there are several hearing that's happened, and there's more conversation to be had. And I did stress, I think, to the sponsors that I hear them and why they brought this forward. I don't think that people should stand in the way of 100% affordable housing projects that have gone through a community process where the community says we want this because of parking. And in this particular case, it sounds like it wasn't a legitimate reason for blocking the project. So I think there's concerns around that. But I'm continuing to follow the conversation because I know there's always there's two sides to it. But I do think if we want to build more affordable housing, particularly 100% affordable housing projects, that we're going to have to be really flexible in order to get these projects online, because we know that residents desperately are saying we need more affordable housing in the city of Boston. It is a part of every conversation that I think we're having in this mayor's race. I also am mindful, though, that certain communities present differently. In some parts of the city, parking is not a major concern. People have driveways, they have homes, there's some municipal parking lots. It's a different landscape. In other parts of the community or the city, people are desperate for parking, even if it's just one car. And some households, of course, have one car, take the team, ride a bike. They do different things depending on where they live. We know in certain parts of the city, there are transit deserts that we have to close where a car is necessary to get to and from. I do think we can change that long term to build up that infrastructure so we're less reliant on our car, and particularly to address issues of climate, but also as we build and develop more economic development opportunities, people will also be less dependent on their car because they can get everything in their 15-minute neighborhood, which is in my transportation plan. So I just think we have to make sure that we're having this conversation across the city of Boston and mindful that each neighborhood differs with respect to the parking issue. And so for me, it's always a bottom-up approach, listening to folks talk about parking, but also stressing we also need to be building more affordable housing. And that is a major concern. And I think we can get to a thoughtful and reasonable place. And I'm confident the sponsors will too.
Thank you. I do. I just want to add on, I don't think it's, it's facetious to say it's often choosing parking or housing in many of these cases, just from the numbers, the finances. But I'm glad that that's an ongoing conversation. I want to shift a little bit now to President Biden just announced an extension of the CDC eviction moratorium after a lot of organizing, including by our Congresswoman and former colleague Ayanna Pressley in DC. What and that's I think good news. It's going to establish stability for folks. It certainly applies to Boston as an area with some level of COVID infections. That's how they're doing it this time. What would you do though as mayor, both in the near term, come November, or moving forward on eviction? Obviously, the Office of Housing Stability can be a big component of that. Can you speak a little bit about how you would use that office or other initiatives when it comes to evictions?
I was pleased to see that announcement by the president, and of course the advocacy, including of our Congresswoman. It's critical. I represent a district currently where folks are facing eviction. And I've actually had folks be evicted illegally in the midst of COVID. And we know it is more expensive to deal with someone who is homeless, right, than to keep them housed. And so I was happy to see that, but it has to be coupled with, right, rental relief funds and rental relief programming that is getting out to not just a tenant, but to landlords. We have to stress that this is not just for tenants, it's really for small landlords in particular to be able to keep their residents housed in the midst of COVID. So greater resources need to go there. The Office of Housing Stability in the city of Boston, all of them deserve numerous applause, frankly, because they've been working day in and day out since the beginning of this pandemic, and they will continue to. So I think, there's Chief Dillon and her team are working really hard. I think we want to make sure they have all the resources they need to continue to fund the rental relief program, the staff they need as well to get the dollars out to help folks navigate the application process. I think they're doing a great job. And as we see infection rates go up across the country, this new Delta variant, we still have neighborhoods that need to be vaccinated. I live in Mattapan. It's one of the lowest in terms of vaccination rates. So we're doing a lot of work as a larger community, a lot of stakeholders working hard to get folks in Mattapan vaccinated. This is going to be a major concern. And so the housing instability is going to continue to be a concern because there's still fear around COVID, and rightfully so. There's light at the end of the tunnel, but we have to be mindful and vigilant going forward. The second piece is the state. I gave a lot of credit to the city of Boston, of course, employees who are working really hard, But these other programs, RAFT and others, I have heard how long it takes to go through the process, how long it takes to get funding from the state out the door. That needs to be sped up. I will tell you, Chief Dillon and her team, I know, and many organizations probably right now on this Zoom are doing a lot to push the state to operate faster, to get funds out. So that we have to do more in partnership with the state. And I will say they have to continue to step up too.
Thank you. And that's a good segue. Actually, I wanted to talk about using, the mayor's office, the bully pulpit, that advocacy platform to the state. Because listen, we talk about, and again, a housing forward, we're trying to focus on things that are achievable in the short term. But obviously long term, the mayor of the city of Boston has a voice, maybe only equaled by the governor in the Commonwealth when it comes to shining attention on things. You mentioned the CPA. Are there other state legislative issues you would focus on when it comes to housing?
A lot. And you said something that's exactly right. The mayor of the city of Boston calls a press conference, everyone shows up, even if they don't know what the person's going to talk about, right? That is a significant bully pulpit to be able to highlight what the city of Boston's grappling with, but what the Commonwealth is grappling with. Because as you said at the outset, there needs to be a regional response to housing, climate, transportation, the racial wealth gap, everything we are dealing with in the city of Boston, we have to have that regional lens. Public safety. I used to work at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council as a general counsel there. And that's one thing I learned, and they did really well. Every issue they were tackling, they used a regional lens. And I think we can do a better job of working with our neighboring municipalities. And the way to do that is, of course, to work hand in hand with the governor and the state legislature on all of these issues. CPA is one of them. I think it's low-hanging fruit to say the CPA works, state, we need more money to match. Why not, right? The second is when we think about issues of homelessness, the opioid crisis we experience in the city of Boston, concentrated, of course, in certain neighborhoods, absolutely on full display at Mass Ave and Melnia Cass, tents going up. That has to be a regional response. For months, I have been pushing, the governor, even when our former mayor was here, sent letters of correspondence to say we can't have a hands-off approach when you talk about supportive housing and helping folks dealing with substance use disorder. Other municipalities have to step up and support Boston in that work. Boston, if you do, look at the data, many residents do not come from the city of Boston. So really pushing other municipalities, what is your plan? What are your plans? I want to see it in writing. And how are we going to work together to close these gaps? So those conversations around funding for supportive housing, location of services, all of that critically important, especially when you're talking about issues of homelessness. The second is in the housing context, voucher programs we've been talking about, down payment assistance, all of the tools you would need to allow your resident to become homeowners in the city of Boston, to improve, for example, the stock of our public housing infrastructure, to also create more programming for folks to move out of public housing into homeownership opportunities. The federal self-sufficiency accounts, FSS is what I brought into the housing authority, but the state has a similar program. So we have to be pushing them on housing infrastructure and resources to improve the public housing stock. Franklin Field hasn't been renovated in 30 years. Down payment assistance, all these tools to become homeowners. The state, we need more funding from them. So it's always working in partnership and not in a siloed way. And I have to add one piece that I think is often not talked about. Youth homelessness, those who are housed in our foster care system, DCF, youth detention centers, all these systems that connect with our youth, that create also instability in their housing because of dynamics related to family instability. That is managed largely by the state, but we know has an impact on the residents in the city of Boston. Major work that we need to do there in terms of housing stability for this population of young people. And then lastly, those who are coming out of our prisons and house of correction. The number one thing we talk about is the need for housing and jobs and economic stability. The state has to play a critical role there. If they don't, we'll be in trouble in the city of Boston.
Thank you. So I'm still jumping around because I know we don't have all the time in the world. So there's another parking question we've got. And while I want to say Housing Forward is focused on housing, I know a lot of our allies and folks who are on this Zoom are transportation focused, but it also plays in to the point of, when you're requiring parking, it often slows or can even halt projects. So the question is, we talked a little bit about parking minimums for affordable projects. What are your thoughts on parking minimums generally? Should they be reduced or changed? And is that going to be part of your planning and rezoning process?
I think there absolutely needs to be a conversation on it, because I have heard for some projects, they should be reduced. If we're talking about transit-oriented development, we should be enforcing that. Your folks shouldn't be moving into a transit-oriented development project with 3 cars.
Okay.
And we've heard that after the fact, a community's like, this sounds great. We'll lower some parking requirements because it's literally right next to a train station. But then residents complaining that folks in this more dense building are taking up parking. So I think there has to be a conversation about the type of project, where it makes sense. And if we truly are addressing issues of climate and resiliency, we have to think about just our reliance on the car, but I think they go hand in hand. Housing stability, of course, housing projects coupled with transportation infrastructure. All of my plans, that they may be listed on the website separate and apart, but they reference each other because for all of these issues, we know we need an intersectional approach. And so I'm open to it. And I know that there's already been conversations on it.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good point. Is, we often talk about housing, denser housing, just in the housing affordability structure. But when you look at research, it's when it comes to climate, denser housing is better for the climate. When it comes to access to opportunity, racial and economic justice, denser housing, it's not a cure-all, but it provides more opportunity in the city of Boston. And I know that's what we're focused on now, but across the Commonwealth. And, talking about your regional approach to some of that is critical, because other cities and towns, I think there's a desire, but not yet they haven't yet achieved playing a larger role in creating more housing for a growing regional population, and having transit, the bike infrastructure, reduced parking minimums, encouraging people to do other modes of transportation is so important in the big picture.
And I will tell you, it is coming up in the vacant lot conversations along Blue Hill Ave.
No.
But we couple that with bus infrastructure, right? And needing to improve the bus infrastructure along Blue Hill Ave, make this system more efficient and accessible. I talk about in transportation, making the bus free as a way to incentivize folks to take the bus.
Right.
Transit-oriented development, denser building along Blue Hill Ave makes total sense. We're seeing a lot of mixed development property proposals, I should say, for Blue Hill Ave. So it's not just housing, but also economic opportunity for folks who live in the community. I even helped, along with working with Chief Dillon and the team, to redesign that whole RFP process to make it easier for women and people of color who are within community, who are smaller developers, to have an opportunity to bid on some of these projects as a way to close the economic gaps. And so when you think about parking standing in the way of some of these projects, that's just a total mistake. If our goal is to incentivize folks to take the T, if our goal is to address issues around, I will say, housing affordability, building it quicker, and at the same time, building the housing quicker. If parking standing in the way, I think that's a major concern. But I also think that folks are open to this. When you are having these thoughtful conversations with community residents at the outset, and then of course, exercising political leadership.
So thank you. I think we're going to do 1 or 2 more questions and let you get back to the campaign trail. But something you just said about the RFP process for small developers or local developers, women-owned businesses, that's something that I think is often lost in the conversation, is that a lot of these delays, a lot of these things for folks in the community who see one of those vacant lots and want to put a 2 or 3 family house on there, they're not in a position to go through a 12 to 24 month zoning process. And, so again, we're talking about increasing housing supply, but also addressing wealth gaps and issues of equity and building long-term generational wealth in our city. And I just think, I don't know if there's a question related to that, but it's just something I wanted to flag because you mentioned it, and it's something we talk about a lot. The increased housing in the city is not just about high rises or even a 6 or a 10-story building. There are real opportunities not only to create more housing, but to empower people who have not had the opportunity to participate in that marketplace to reap the benefits to build that wealth. And I just want, I guess it's more, instead of a question, it's a thank you for highlighting that.
It's critical. And you said it right. Everything in my housing plan drives to that economic opportunity, closing the racial wealth gap, and creating more opportunities in neighborhoods that have been under-resourced for so long, not just for infrastructure and housing changes in the landscape of those communities, but to make sure that as we're building that wealth, that it's going to the very folks who live there. There are developers, builders, architects in many of these communities who want and need an opportunity. We can create that in the city of Boston by making the process easier for folks to participate. And so we're doing that in a very creative way with some of these vacant lots, but we can do it for larger scale projects too. And I think we need to think outside the box on just that if we want to close the racial wealth gap and create more opportunity and wealth in communities across the entire city of Boston.
I think it's really important. So, all right, I said one or two more questions. We're going to have at least one more now. I just came in the chat box. So, as mayor, what's the first thing you would do to help to serve unhoused Bostonians, people who don't have homes?
Where do I begin? So, one is, I think there are the vacant lots. I know I keep coming back to it, but we have the ability to do things on these lots swiftly. I mean, I'm doing it right now. And so those who are unhoused, we're right now activating a lot for this very issue. Those who are unhoused, who need opportunity, who need a home, who need job and workforce development, all of it wrapped in these wraparound services, we're activating a lot right now in my district. I would immediately activate all of these 100 lots that I said, but to address those critical issues too. And that is possible. And then I think that coupled with that, public housing. We have a lot of public housing in the city of Boston, but we have folks who've been living in public housing 20, 30 years who want to move up and move out. And there are ways in which to create that in the city of Boston through some of this existing programming, which frees up that public housing for those who desperately need it, who are low income or no income residents and who need a start. This housing, of course, could be be made available relatively quickly. And I would continue building upon that program that is already in existence.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, this will be the last. I'll let you have the last word, but here's a prompt. As mayor in a city like Boston, the mayor has huge impact over housing, construction, et cetera. How do you? And feel free to run with this, and talk more broadly. But what are some things, what's your philosophy when it comes to increasing supply, whether it's appointees to boards and commissions, to staff, some of the things we've talked about? Could you maybe talk about the one or two or three top items and then whatever else you'd like to say about housing as we wrap things up?
Well, one is building more. I mean, that's one thing that Mayor Walsh got right. Building more housing is critical. And we can do that faster and make it less expensive and less time consuming by, of course, changing all the processes in ways I described earlier and expanding upon the staff within the BPDA, ISD, and hiring staff that has greater expertise, and also pulling certain types of projects out of certain Article 80 processes, et cetera. All of that is possible relatively quickly because it's all within the control of the city of Boston. But for me, it's also making sure that we're being intentional about what we're building. I have heard again and again that we need to be building more housing for people who are unhoused, for people who are dealing with homelessness or substance use disorder or domestic violence. We also need to be building more housing for those who are family or starting families, who have a family, whether that's 2, 3 bedrooms or 4-bedroom rental opportunities or single family, 2-family or 3-family homes. That family framework is missing. I've heard that a great deal. Seniors. I have a lot of seniors that want to move and downsize from existing large homes, particularly Dorchester, certain neighborhoods. They want to live in intergenerational housing opportunities. There are some of those projects. I've been pushing for the city to activate city lots for some of these intergenerational housing opportunities. So being intentional about what we're building. And we know that we can, of course, also be more intentional about the price and the pricing point. And by streamlining processes, it will make it easier for us to do just that. I will say everything in my housing plan has been vetted by folks across a wide spectrum. So whether it's advocates and folks who've been doing the work for a really long time to push the city of Boston to do better when it comes to housing affordability and displacement, pushing for greater investment in community land trusts, pushing for, of course, different types of co-op models within all of these structures, pushing for housing to be built at affordable pricing points, right? Using lower AMIs. Engaging folks who've been doing that community work for a long time. I also engage folks who've been building in the city of Boston for a long time, who deeply love this city, who want to be a part of the solutions, and listen to them talk about just how difficult it is to get a project through, just how difficult, even when the community says we want that project, and the developer and builder has gone through a robust community process to then go to the BPDA who wants to change the design. It's like, no, the community wants it this way. So I engage a whole swath of folks in my housing plan to put forth a plan that is practical, that is doable, that's within the power and control of the city of Boston, that really pulls at every tool in our toolkit, every lever to, in the immediate, and of course, we're blessed to become the next elected mayor in the city of Boston, to swiftly address this issue. And all of it builds upon the work I've already done as a counselor. And all of it also drives at closing the racial wealth gap and creating greater economic opportunity in every neighborhood, including those neighborhoods like Dorchester, Mattapan, Roxbury that have been under-resourced for a very long time.
Right.
And
Well, thank you.
And Hyde Park and other neighborhoods as well.
And the entire city. We know you are running for mayor of the entire city.
That's exactly right.
But listen, thank you, Counselor. It was a pleasure to see you, to talk to you about these issues. And I just want to say, I think I hope I'm speaking for everyone who's tuned in, but your attention to detail on the policy side, your plan on this shows that you put a lot of thought into this, into being practical as well as aspirational, which I think is important. So thank you for that. I want to just quickly thank everyone else for tuning in, for the questions. I apologize if we didn't get to every single question that was out there. I want to thank our Housing Forward Board and our team, Kendall Feynman, who is our Director of Policy and External Relations, who really has pulled these things together. Everyone should be getting emails, but tomorrow at noon, we have another city council colleague who's running for mayor, Michelle Wu, will be on here. John Barros will be on Friday. So everyone, please tune in, send your questions. This will be posted on our website. Really appreciate your attention and focus to this. Counselor, have a wonderful rest of the day, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Kendall, and everyone. And of course, if folks have follow-up questions, they can follow up andreacampbell.org. All of my information is there. So thank you so very much. Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.